Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to my good friends in Carlisle School District. Dave Nagel here. Very excited to share with you just an overview. Bryce and I had an opportunity to meet in San Francisco. We got a chance to see John and a few other folks out at the Visible Learning Institute. When Bryce and I met, we talked about having this group, the leadership, have a very solid overview, understanding of as we go into the next round of assessment building with the teachers and some of the BLCs of what this work really means and the importance of this group, the leadership group, to understand and have a really um, solid basis for their knowledge and learning moving forward with what this work means and what it entails and how to guide and lead it. So, just a quick overview, about 15 minutes or so, and we're looking forward to connecting next Friday. I'm recording this on the 21st, but on the 28th, come together on a webinar. So, just a chance to do some review for some, but maybe provide a little bit more of a background about where we're going and how we lead to this important element of developing really quality formative assessments with our teachers. One of the backdrops as I guide any group when we're talking about assessment is any assessment really comes down to these 3 points. What's my purpose? And then when do I have enough evidence to make an inference? And all joking aside, we do this every day. You're driving to work and you're trying to get there on time, maybe with a Starbucks if you have to pass one, and you pass a Starbucks and you realize, wow, there's 15 people in the drive-through and 17 people in line, and you make an inference from evidence that you can't meet your purpose. Now, that's what we do every day. We're always making inferences from evidence based on what our purpose is. And so when we guide our teachers with the same emphasis, when they're really focusing on what was your purpose in terms of what you were trying to assess to determine what you needed to know about student learning, and sometimes it's very precise, sometimes it's a little bit more broad, sometimes it's procedural, sometimes it's conceptual. But one of the things that, with rare exception, we haven't done enough to support our teachers is helping them be a better, to help them better diagnose, to help them really better understand the importance of diagnosing where students are. And sometimes we either over utilize the evidence and make an assumption that students have a false positive or false negative. Teachers, and I make this comment a lot, will make an erroneous assumption at some point in time in one of my son's educational career that they don't understand complex characters because they don't care about Atticus Finch. And we miss that. Or because they really get into one text, we assume that they have complete understanding of complex characters, and we make that either false positive or false negative assumption, or the assessment items we've created really weren't looking at complex characters. They were looking more at comprehension and some other types of elements. So really understanding what my purpose is will help a teacher understand, are the assessment items they're putting in front of students that either they're creating or have been generated for them, really giving them the ability to make a quality inference. So one of the things that I wanted to just kind of guide through, and again, this is quick overview. I'm not going to stop at any time for a reflection because I figured you could watch it. We're going to come back together here on the 28th. But we hear a lot about collective teacher efficacy. It was the theme of the Visible Learning Institute. Effect size 1.57. So on average, that means we're getting 4 years growth in 1 year's time. But in our profession, we have been caught so many times with that buzzword, or thinking that, okay, we'll apply feedback, or we'll apply RTI, or we'll apply some collective teacher efficacy, or build it within our school and automatically get some of those impacts. Well, there's really 3 things that, if you dig into the evidence, and really it's common sense, to build collective teacher efficacy. And John and Matt with football, John that you play, and Matt being a high school coach, and certainly Tim and the rest of the team, thinking about where you've been in athletics, but coaches who come together and they build a plan do this all the time. First off, they apply new knowledge. So they make sure that they understand the drills that they're putting into place. So we think about making sure our teachers really understand what it means to build and develop quality assessment items. So my point is in our data team meetings, making sure that we give them opportunities after these days to really continue to dig deep into the work. So we're providing them the support, but we're also asking for the accountability, that there's positive interdependence, that when teams come together, PLC teams, data teams, coaching teams, they all have responsibilities to do their job for what they were supposed to build in terms of the assessment items that they were supposed to bring to the table. And then that the assessment items build fine-grained discourse into student learning. When coaches are watching film, they're not looking at the outcome of the game. They're looking at that one particular play. So we don't want our teachers looking at the entire assessment item the entire assessment results, whether or not students get 70% or 80% or some number. We're looking at specific items and student responses to go, what was their learning gap? Did that item give us an opportunity to get into their thinking? And so as I guide us through what the process is, I'm hoping you see some connections there to this is how we live out some of the elements within collective teacher efficacy. And I certainly want to go back to the hierarchy of collaboration when we've established that every team should be getting to level 3, that basic instructional dialogue, but really level 4 is where we want them to be living more, making inferences based on data, and then I specifically added evidence. The more quality inferences they will make, the more that they will align their strategies and actions. And just as a footnote, I use a lot of metaphors and examples, but we, as you know, when we go to our doctors and if we have a problem with our foot and our general practitioner sends us to a podiatrist, the reason why he or she does that is not because the podiatrist has more effective strategies to treat our foot. It's because they can better diagnose. And so making sure we're looking at that level of diagnosis so that way the inferences based on what our next steps will be. That's why this process, and we certainly got some amazing feedback, and I attribute it to the teachers and the legwork that was done before with the group that came back in February. But there was a very strong, and Bryce and Dana and the rest of the folks that were there said it was as strong of feedback in terms of them saying, this is helping me learn. And also apply it in their PLC data team meetings. I think this is an opportunity for us to build that next layer within the teacher element, but now it's time for us as school leaders and instructional leaders to make sure we have enough understanding so we can guide it forward. So that's where I'm going to kind of give us a little bit of an overview through this webinar. And when we look at Vivian Robinson's work, or the 5 dimensions of leadership that has to happen from a principal school leader, all of them are important, but number 1, and it doubles any of the rest of them, is promoting and participating in teacher learning and development. So why it's important that we show up on these days as instructional leaders and really learn the process and go through it and sit with our teams and actually build the assessment with them is going to help us lead their learning and development over time, because far too often in our profession, whether it's Iowa, Indiana, anywhere else, we've all been there, we've either not done enough to support that, or we've led an initiative that has either erroneously led to teachers thinking they need to be compliant based and just fill it out, or they've been able to think, well, if I just do it this way in front of maybe my leader, in front of my peers, I can go back to my room and do it differently. So we're going to be pushing not only that concrete technical side of building a quality assessment, but also that assessment literacy. And I'm going to guide us through this team's some extra resources and things that will help you lead and guide with the right kinds of questions, so we don't pigeonhole any teacher or set of teachers from doing it one specific way. But we also make sure that we check for some really early understanding, and we allow the teams to grow and develop at their level, but making sure we're keeping them on the proverbial right track to make sure I can understand, based on the responses I'm hearing in their PLC data team meetings, when they have a conversation with me, when I'm in walkthroughs and conversations in classrooms, that is really helping promote their assessment literacy. So, and you can certainly pause the recording longer if you need to. I'm not going to read every quote, but I'm going to bring in James Popham's work. And everything we do in our profession is making inferences. Assessment is about inference making, and educational assessment revolves all the time around what is that assessment. We think about what a grade is. A grade, in a sense, is an inference, an opinion, an inference based on the evidence that I've made where the student is. And we all know that there's issues with that. What's more important is not just what was reported out in the grade or what I reported where the student is how did it impact my next layer of teaching? And one of the things that we'll talk a lot about, and even your teachers, like happens with a lot of the groups I work with, is as I guide them through and are looking at assessment items, and I'm just thinking in the moment, multiple choice or something that is selected response. Some items are less wrong than others. The teachers will step back and go, how can that be the case? When we think about it, D was the best answer because it addressed the 2-step equation and correct computation, or D addressed analysis of text. But response C was pretty close because it would have shown that they're understanding the 2-step equation, or it showed that they had some really solid understanding of what the comprehension was. They didn't quite get it right. Teachers can buy back time if their assessments are of quality to know really where students are, so we don't waste some of the RTI or some of the instructional strategies that we come up with because students are maybe more proficient than we think, or we really identify where their gap is. And formative assessment is a planned process. So as I guide the teachers in August, I'm going to be asking them to build an assessment that they will implement between, let's just say, September 10th to Halloween. I don't want them building one on that day that they would implement day one, because they won't be ready, because they have to step back and think about it. And what were the teaching tools I needed to use? Was that really what I wanted to assess? So when we come back, and I'm hoping the teachers are building more assessments over time, they should be building one in October for what they're going to implement in February. And what they're going to implement and build in February is for the next fall. And it is really more planned. We have to give our teachers permission to do that. We also have to ask them in the right way to be held accountable for how are you thinking much more ahead than maybe they have in the past. And that doesn't mean they can't utilize some of the existing assessment and curriculum that is already in place. But above all else, we must assess to diagnose. And I think that is the shift. And John Hattie talks about the mind frame. Assessment is feedback from me. We are assessing to diagnose. That doesn't mean we can't put it in the grade book. But I'm not assessing for any other reason to know where the student is in their learning, or how far or close away they are from proficiency or the mark, so I know my next steps. And that might mean that my next steps are to continue on because they're getting it. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between when teachers are assessing conceptual knowledge, which if we are, students never gain concepts in one day, they gain it over time. Procedural knowledge, building my timeline, my math facts, some of those skills in foreign language and conjugation, those are procedural skills that I need to do more assessing quicker, because once they get it, then they have it down. And so we're diagnosing, but also thinking, what skill type am I diagnosing? So what I like to call CSAs, which are concise, empowering, short cycle assessments. And they're concise in that they're focused on a specific set of concept and skills from our impact or priority standards or our impact or priority ELTs. But they're concise. They're really focused on making sure I'm assessing those specific skills. Empowering, that they provide quality inferences to the teacher about student learning, as well as any possible misconceptions. One of the activities that we'll do is making sure teachers work through writing items to where here is the best answer, but my other choices tell me a possible misconception. I'm not necessarily with my fingers tricking the students, but what I want to make sure is every choice they could give me or every response they might give me from a rubric that is very clear gives me a chance for them to tell me where their mistakes might be, not because I want to ding them, but because I want to know what to do next. They're short, they're concise, they're for a 2 or 3 week unit. And so one of the things that I will mention, especially with all levels, but at the secondary, that doesn't mean I might not give my full with my fingers chapter or unit test or my unit assessment. But that doesn't mean when we come together as a PLC or a data team, we need a PLC or data team on all of it, because some things are more important than others. So what were those things within those 2 or 3 weeks that were more important because they're going to be critical moving on to the next unit or over the course of the school year? And again, they're formative. And when I say immediate and decisive instructional adjustments, meaning when we are going to use them in a data team meeting, if it was important enough for us to come together and look at the results, then we should make sure that it was important enough for us to say, let's really think about what instructional, and it might not even be adjustments in terms of doing anything different. It might be that we continue with what we're doing because we're seeing improvement in some of those specific skills, because the assessments, we're making sure they gave us enough information. So we might over-assess some things because they were more important and not assess others, or assess them with much less importance. So kind of continuing on that point, they're aligned, and pre and post assessment within units. We'll talk a little bit about how there's a time for the mirror pre and post assessment where I'm going to give the same pre and the same post. There's also what I would like to call the like pre assessment, where I'm assessing just a very specific skill early on, but I'm not going to worry at the end of the unit if I could compare pre to post, because I was only checking early for some basic understanding of a couple of skills, because if you didn't have that, you were going to struggle. And so there's a time for that pre to post to look at what I would call, as we all know, the SMART goal, but that shouldn't always be the norm. And sometimes we might be focusing on 1 or 2 distinct skills in the pre-assessment that I'll be able to see how well did those propel us forward, because if students don't have those skills, they're really, really going to struggle. So we'll talk a little bit about how making sure our teams don't, by default, just create the same pre and post every time. There's a time for that, but maybe something that we've done more often than not. And again, that's a chance to buy back some time. So the 4 simple steps that I'm only going to guide us through a couple of those through this webinar is determining what I like to call our impact or our priority standards. And certainly we've done some of this work in Carlisle. to unwrap or uncover them to identify the accurate rigor level. And then because of that, determine what is the assessment type I need to use. Because not always will we need to be using the same assessment type for everything we're assessing. And then what is that specific rubric or scoring guide that we're going to provide the student that is clear, that maybe empowers the students more to guide their own learning. And certainly that was some really good feedback from group that came in February, that it helped them maybe make those more concise, maybe make them less cumbersome. What your teachers will walk away with on August 10th and 11th is a deeper understanding of some foundational assessment practices that are specific to writing the assessment, but also maybe more on their quick checks and their formative assessments that they do not only within the classroom, but they agree upon as a PLC what they're looking for. And I highlighted there in yellow things that will save them time. That we can do things that will help us assess at a better level, that might help us intervene earlier or realize, you know what, they're getting it enough, I can actually move on. Hopefully complete a good chunk of an assessment, but then predetermine some look-fors before the unit starts into some student learning and understanding. What are some things that we maybe haven't thought enough about the learning progression, that if I catch that earlier in the unit, I'm going to have a better chance later, which might make me better utilize the curriculum, might make me better plan early on for some things I want to check for. And all of us who've been classroom teachers have thought about this before. When did we realize that we can't teach it all? When do we realize that there's no way I'm going to be able to cover everything? So when we talk about what the priority standards are for a unit, coming from some of Larry Ainsworth's work, they're a selected set of some of those standards that students should know and be able to do by the end of the next grade level or course. And they're the assured competencies that every student must learn and demonstrate. And I added that little bullet point there at the end. The more that students are addressing these, and we all know that there's units where there's some things that are just more important than others. With my fingers, when we think about grading them, we should put more weight into what's more important. And that way, more than anything, what we won't have is inflated grades, where students are much less proficient than their grade is indicating. And so the idea of priority standards comes down to endurance. What's going to stand the test of time? The readiness conversation, which is critically important within a vertical team, meaning the math or the English teachers at the middle school, or algebra and the geometry at the high school. What are those things that they really need to have going from one course to the next to the next? And that's where we create more of that positive interdependence, because what we are assessing at the 7th grade level impacts how our 8th grade teachers are going to be given a product here the next year, and things that John can guide his teachers with. We're going to talk a little bit about leverage. What are those skills that have to be embedded? Literacy, for example, across the board. And literacy is a shared responsibility. And certainly it's important, obviously, in social studies and science, but sometimes we miss it in a course like math. But the highest failed PARCC and Smarter Balance items across the country are the highest Lexile scores. Students need to read in math. They need to close read. They don't need to read novels and paragraphs and deep level, but they need to be very precise. And then finally, what is on our external assessment? So for now, our IO assessments, maybe it eventually goes to PARCC or Smarter Balance, but what we're considering there is not teaching to the test, but making sure that the format of the assessment doesn't get in the way of students demonstrating their understanding. So how we format our assessments, and it obviously comes last, is an important consideration. And then with every unit, there's supporting standards that connect or enhance the priorities. So for example, if a student is going to demonstrate to me their level of comprehension after reading a text, they can basically do it one of two ways. They can write it to me, or they can speak it to me. So if my focus is on the comprehension, the writing or speaking and listening is the supporting standard. If I was focusing on how well they could write, they have to read something, they have to listen to something. So that becomes the supporting standard. And so for that unit, they are weighted differently, and not weighted in terms of points just for the grade, but I can weight the assessment so I know I'm focusing more on that essential skill that I was really teaching. And so some standards will be a priority in one unit and maybe a supporting in another. And this is just an example, and you've got the slides that I've sent Bryce the PowerPoint. But as I guide folks through what are the, when we look at our priority standards, can they meet certain criteria? And when we look at endurance and the external assessment, and then the readiness, can they apply to be applied to other levels of learning within literacy? Are they important for confidence into the next level? I purposely pulled this example from a district in California. The other thing to always consider is, do our current assessment results support emphasis on that particular standard? That's when we look at standard 910-9, analyze seminal documents that um, of historical and literary significance, Washington's Farewell Address, Gettysburg Address, etc. That's not as much of a priority as determining the central idea of a text and analyzing its development over the course of that text. So as I guide, and we're not going to get into the deep level of this with the groups, but I'm kind of highlighting as teams are over the course of the next few years looking at what their priority standards are. This might determine not only is it a priority for one unit, but should it be taught multiple times. And this is just one example for a middle school science one. And when we think about developing and using a model to describe the number of atoms does not change in a chemical reaction, you can really get through life without knowing that. Even as a science teacher, it's not really that important. It's not necessarily connected to, if we look at leverage, other content areas. So when I guide teams in terms of how they're determining their priority standards, so for a science team, for an English team, if it meets 4 or more, it should be a priority. So this particular standard only met 3, but it is a priority because the science department in this particular school said that's a critical standard. So just like your varsity football coach has the same cadence and blocking scheme for the JV and freshmen, etc., the same thing should be happening as we're building our assessments initially, individually, and at the team level, but also as we look over time. If we say that's an important skill for 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, math, English, science, etc., because that's in the Carlisle English Math Science program, it becomes a priority. And that's where, going back to that point about positive interdependence and the accountability across the board, that if we say it's an important standard to teach, then we're going to agree to teach it well. We're agreeing to teach it well, not just for me, but because I'm going to be passing those students on to my peers. So a little bit more there than I'm going to get into with our teachers, but for this group, I wanted to plant that seed as we think about making sure as we're guiding our teams for how they are assessing, what they are assessing, that there's some vertical alignment, some opportunity for the vertical teams to come together and share. This is just one quick example when we think about how, when we look at their standards, I just pulled a language arts one, standard 7.1. And one of the things that your teachers, I could tell it's like that breath of fresh air when they realize they're going to be addressing that standard as a priority standard in Unit 1 and Unit 7. But I'm also going to hit it in Units 2 and 3. Teachers often struggle with, when do I move on? When do I move the herd? When do I pause? When do I stop? Well, some of it should be based on how often that standard is going to be taught, and is it going to be taught again? So if I know it's going to be addressed in other units, I'm less concerned about whether or not students got it and more about, are they getting it? But then we have standards like Standard 10, whether it's in reading for informational, reading for literature, it's always a supporting standard. We always want students to be reading on grade level. We don't make it a priority because for any one unit, the priority standards are the sole focus. We have students in 7th grade that are far behind that might not ever read on the 7th grade level by the end of 7th grade. We certainly want them reading on 8th grade by the end of 8th grade or 9th grade. We have students in 7th grade that are reading above grade level, but it's always an ongoing support. And I can bring in math examples where there's certain skills that are always embedded within every unit. So this is, again, a bigger picture than we will get into for just these 2 days with the particular teachers on the 10th and the 11th. But I thought as this team leads throughout the year, this is a great opportunity to kind of guide and help our teachers to know when it's a priority, we're really focusing on that standard, but also certain standards will be priority some unit, supporting in others. And then, as I mentioned a little bit ago, that idea that literacy is a shared responsibility and that the Common Core standards, whether they're Common Core labeled or not, for English, literacy, history, science, technical subject, as a former biology teacher, the thing my kids needed more than anything was to be literate, was to be able to understand text. And so as a science, social studies, even math teacher or related arts teachers, how they're utilizing the reading and language arts standards as supports for what they're teaching in their subjects is another thing that we will address to some degree. So quick pause. And again, I'm not going to pause the recording. I'm going to have the groups do this a little bit with me. But how do we define cognitive rigor? Because the last piece I want to get into is how we will build in how we better assure that the assessments that we're creating with our students we're going to put in front of them have the right level of rigor. How do we define that? When we look up the definition of just rigor, you will find words like harsh, rigid, unwavering. Why? Because unfortunately, all of us are going to go through rigor mortis someday. It's just kind of part of the deal. And that term comes from the same Latin root as rigor mortis. So now we've applied that into something in education and maybe not even thought what that really means. First thing we have to realize, and I will address this with the teachers kind of on a deep level, is rigor is not about more. It's not about more homework or just so much work. It's not about quantity. And it's not that some students can't do it, or that if I need to support you early, that it's lost its level of rigor. If I am helping my son hit a pitch baseball and I need to slow down and lob it to him or have him hit it off the tee, that doesn't mean that he can't necessarily have the same rigor when he's able to do it on his own. And so we're going to use Webb's depth of knowledge much more. And I know we've talked a little bit about this. There was kind of a mixed degree of understanding with DOK when I was with the group last time. But it's how deeply a student needs to understand the content for a response, which is why the content actually comes to life a little bit more, but to make sure I understand the complexity within the standard. And then it's the assessment question that determines the rigor, not the student work, not the quantity of student response, but what was the question? And as a summary, as a review for some, but DOK 1, there's one right answer. DOK 2, there's one right answer, but there's a justification. I have to give some evidence as to why that was the best answer, the best textual evidence. When we pass that precipice between DOK 2 and 3, there's more than one correct answer. And DOK 4 is where we're connecting ideas. Now, very few standards, very few skills, when we pull them out of unwrapping, are ever written at a 4. But rarely in life, just like in school, are we working with just one standard. In the interim moment, I might be focusing on one skill, but eventually I want my students to put it together. So we don't want to have this thought, and I hear this a lot from teachers, that, and why it's important for us as leaders to realize DOK 1 is not necessarily bad. DOK 4 is not necessarily good, in fact, just the opposite. And it's not like we're going to look for a progression, because the difference between depth of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy is that key word, taxonomy. There is not a taxonomy with DOK. It is not necessary that students need to always progress from a 1 to a 2 to a 3 to a 4. Students might go back and forth as they're learning and doing things together, but we want to know where the standard is written, so we're assessing it accurately at that level. And just quick example, a science example, but describe the 3 main parts of a eukaryotic cell. There's only 3. There's one right answer: nucleus, cell membrane, cytoplasm. When I describe the differences between plant and animal cells, there's some justification I have to give, but there's a ceiling there. There's only so many differences. When I'm describing the model that I might build to represent the inner workings of a cell and how those different parts function together, there's more than one right answer. So what I'm getting at is we can't use the word like describe by default and think that that tells us exactly what the level of rigor is. And again, for this webinar, just as an overview, but this is something we're going to get into a lot on day 1. And again, back to some of my early points, why I really am guiding this team to be as participatory as we can be on these days, so we really have a solid understanding of this work, so we can guide and lead it regardless of what teacher we're working with or what group we're working with. Doesn't matter what our background is, doesn't matter what our teaching background or our content subject matter knowledge is. We should be able to guide the different groups based on where they are, which is why the learning is so important for this leadership team. And then one of the things that the teachers will be able to see is this is where there is the ability to write quality selected response items. And it's not that we're pushing for multiple choice assessment or testing, but the faster we can assess our students and get really good information, the more we can save some time if they're of quality. When we get into DOK level 3, and there's more than one right answer, it's going to be more needed for us to ask the students to construct their response, not necessarily with long written responses, but I'm going to have to give them an opportunity to show me, because there could be more than one right answer. And of course, then we're going to need a scoring guide. So finally, I'm just going to walk us through just a couple quick examples of how we will kind of guide the group and help them as they're determining their assessments around any standard. How do we determine the rigor level? So we take this particular standard, RL 3.1. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull out the nouns and the verbs. We're going to pull out the declarative knowledge, which are characters, story, challenges, but then also what are the procedural knowledge? What are the skills the students are going to have to do? And then we're going to ask them to pull out the nouns or the noun phrases, characters, story, major events, major challenges. And then I specifically listed response. And this is a little bit next level, but for me to respond to major events, I've got to know what a response is. So all I'm doing here is what are all the nouns, what are all the concepts my students need to be able to know? And then what are the skills? And if we dig into the standard, students have to describe how characters respond to major events, and then how characters respond to major challenges. And then we will go into the cognitive rigor matrix, and I will guide us more deeply and more succinctly when we come together to determine where, starting with Bloom's to get us in the ballpark, but what are the students really going to be asked to do based on the standard? And what we will find when we dig into that, students responding to the events is actually at a different rigor level than responding to challenges. And so that's where I'm going to need to make sure my assessment that's written for that particular set of skills allows me to know that they were at that level 3. Here's a math standard. I'm just going to leave it up for a second and kind of raising my hand and thinking for a second, Tim, this is one of the standards your teachers are kind of working on, but the standard alone scares me with all the stuff that's in it. But we can first go in and circle and pull out what are all of the skills, and then what are all of the concepts, what are all of the declarative knowledge our kids are going to have to know and be able to do. The standard in and of itself is a mouthful. There's a lot here. And so now we pull out first, what were those concepts? What were the nouns in there? So they not only had to do whole numbers, but multi-digit whole numbers, base 10, number names, etc. And then what were the skills? And you can see here that one standard, and this is where I kind of guide the teams. When you're writing an assessment, there should be 2 to 3 priority standards for a unit. But that's sort of a guide. More than 3, with rare exception, there's often too much to be able to have a focus. Here's one where this might be the only standard for a 2-week unit, possibly, because there is so much in there. And you can see they had to read multi-digit numbers, number names. They had to write those. Then they had to compare and use and record. And even though the DOK is at a lower rigor level, that doesn't mean that the difficulty isn't there as our students are coming into this unit. The complexity wasn't as high. So just because it's at a DOK 1 doesn't mean that this is a lower level by default standard, a lower level by default unit. It might be more foundational for some students early. Went ahead and pulled a science one specifically, and one of the things about the NGSS that we'll talk a little bit about, and I don't try to go too granular, and I don't know how many science teachers we might have, but there is different ways that we can break down the science standard, as whether or not it was a process skill, whether or not it was one of the cross-cutting concepts, but the same idea. Here we have listed the concepts and then the verbs. And what's important is we can see for this particular standard, they had to construct the argument and they had to present the argument. Both of those are at a level 3. Now, certainly, as students are constructing, they could be thinking about presenting it. Presenting it doesn't mean they have to stand in front of the group and speak. They could present it in written form, but they've got to present that argument and then use evidence to support that. And I specifically listed that gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on masses of interacting objects, because they have to do that with all 3. They have to construct the claim that does that, present the claim that does that, use the claim that does that. And so as a science teacher, we might say we are going to focus a particular unit of study early on that only hits construct and present and maybe doesn't necessarily use it early on, but later on we're going to use it. And then we would guide them how does your assessment make sure that it really addresses those 2 points, and then maybe another unit comes back to it. But what I don't want is the teachers, and this is where our group is, to say, let's make sure we put certain items on there so we possibly address it. It's better to address half of the standard well, and we're just clear as we're writing the assessment or we're looking at it, as opposed to just making sure we try to say we've quote unquote covered it. And that's, I think, the balance. And I think really the group, with rare exception, that came in February just embraced that and was ready to move forward. And I would be surprised if that's not the case with the next group, just because of where I've known you guys have been in Carlisle. So just one other one. This is just a language arts one. And again, I've sent you the slides, so you've got them as well. But this particular 11th grade standard, and it's one that's kind of a catch-all. I mean, students should not be walking out with a diploma that says that you are ready for life if they can't determine the central idea of a primary source, provide a summary, how those details developed over the course of the text. And let's face it, this is an English standard. I can do this in science, social studies, etc. Got my concepts, and again, this is where when we ask folks to unwrap, it wasn't just summary, it was accurate summary. As simple as that seems, and even though this is a 11th grade level, that's why we say it's not just the noun, it's the noun phrase. We have our skills, and we have our DOK. And again, I will be more intentional with how we kind of guide them using the Hess matrix going in. But as a final point, what I'm going to ask everyone to do, and this was, apologize there, I didn't change the slides. It's not February 1st and 2nd. This was part of the old webinar that I cut and pasted, but it's August 10th and 11th. But I'm going to ask everyone to practice, if possible, unwrapping a standard coming into those days. Now, we can't necessarily get every teacher that's coming in on the 10th and 11th to do that, but I'm certainly going to ask this group, and I will guide us through that when we meet on our webinar about how that would look. But I want you to practice coming in, because the more you will have that visceral understanding, the more you will be able to guide and lead and also model for your teachers that, hey, I'm doing the same thing alongside as you're doing. And we'll just have a little Google Doc that folks will be able to do that in. And then the acid test to kind of wrap up here is as we're unwrapping a standard, which is why whenever I ask a group to unwrap, and if we're working together in a PLC, I want everyone to unwrap the same standard individually and then share, what did you do? What did I do? What did Bryce do? What did Barb do? So that we can say, okay, are we close enough? And while it might not be exactly the same, do we agree on the same level of context, rigor, agreement of concept and skills? Because that alone will drive more cohesiveness and alignment in terms of how we are assessing. And as a final footnote, that should drive two things. Number one, our not only ability to create and develop and design assessments, but also our ability to become better consumers of what's existing. Those assessments that teachers are already using that have been pre-fabbed by Houghton Mifflin or Pearson or somewhere else, teachers should be able to utilize those, but not necessarily use them verbatim. And then more importantly, do their practice activities, the things they're doing on a daily basis with their lessons, their videos, their activities, do they line up with what we're assessing? And if there's one place that we miss in our profession, we can create a quality assessment. But our practice activities, that what we have in place that we're going to put in front of the kids, don't line up, or don't line up enough that might really help not only save the teacher's time, but have the students become much more authentic as opposed to compliance-based learners. And so, again, I'm going to come back to this each and every time. My purpose, which is why we'll guide them through the unwrapping, is why we do that. And then when do I have enough evidence to make an inference? And so I hope this wasn't too much. I made it a little bit longer because I know you guys would have about a week to at least watch through it, and then we'll come together on the webinar next week. But as always, I'm honored to work with the team. I think there's just a first-class group of educators in Carlisle, and I say that with complete sincerity and honesty, and I'm just excited to work with the group. But I really want your thoughts and questions when we come back next week. But I'm really going to encourage us to be as participatory on those 2 days so that we, this leadership group, have an understanding of where the teams have gone. And certainly with the BLCs of Cami and Leah and the others that were already there, we've got a group that's going to help push this forward even more at the ground level. But we as leaders, I think, can have a better chance. So as we're guiding through our walkthroughs and through our PLC walkthrough evaluations to really help empower the teams and have, as I said before, the right amount of support with the right amount of accountability. So I look forward to touching base with everybody next Friday, and I hope you have a great weekend and a great rest of your week.